the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
We're thinking, okay, now that we have this centralized infrastructure, how can we use it to either create new newsroom opportunities or work with existing newsrooms so that together, we're actually like coloring in all those empty spaces and serving the people who aren't being served right now.
This is Small Press, Big Ideas, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Warwick. Small Press, Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Okay, today on the podcast, I am joined by Warwick Sabin. He is the president and CEO of Deep South Today down in Mississippi. Are you just in Mississippi? Sorry, I didn't ask before.
It's okay. We're in Mississippi and New Orleans.
Mississippi, right, and New Orleans.
And I'm coming to you from New Orleans, just so you know.
Straight from New Orleans, all right, from the Big Easy. And Warwick is the president and CEO of Deep South Today, and they originally came across my radar from a piece in Neiman Lab a few months ago called Multi-Local Newsrooms, Aimed to Get More News to More People. And I thought I like the model, and I've seen stuff like this popping up more and more. So thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's a very brief intro. I would love if you could just share some of your background and kind of the path you took to become the CEO of Deep South Today, to give some people some background.
Sure. Yeah, my background's a little bit unusual, but it kind of, really kind of nicely, I think, prepared me for this role. I've spent my entire career in the nonprofit or sort of government sector. I sort of started as a press secretary on Capitol Hill, and as someone who really actually, thought he was going to be a journalist and always wanted to go into journalism. My mom's a journalist, sort of grew up in that atmosphere. So, after Capitol Hill, I actually went down to Arkansas to help President Clinton start his foundation. And that was really my first experience of sort of nonprofit work. And after a few years at the foundation, I actually finally sort of scratched my itch in journalism and became an associate editor at the Arkansas Times. And I wrote and edited for several years, and then sort of accidentally ended up on the business side of publishing when the Oxford American Magazine, which is a national magazine based in Little Rock, had some financial trouble. And I knew the people over there. They asked if I could kind of help them out. I volunteered as an unpaid sort of interim publisher of the magazine, and then did a good enough job where I quit my other job and just became the publisher of the magazine. And so I learned a lot about the business side, but it was also a nonprofit. So that kind of nonprofit journalism model sort of took with me. While I was publisher of the magazine, I got elected to the state legislature in Arkansas, and I served 3 terms there. And instead of running for a 4th term, I ran for mayor of Little Rock in 2018, but I lost. And then went up to Washington for a few years and worked at the Aspen Institute, which is, obviously a terrific organization, and then was approached about helping to get Deep South Today started a few years ago. I'll just say what's prepared me for this is that sort of grounding and familiarity in the South, certainly understanding both sides of journalism, the editorial side and the business side, understanding nonprofit management and philanthropy, putting that all together, I think really, has helped me sort of, really kind of get a good start into this kind of work.
That's awesome. Yeah, everybody has such a different story, how they get into it. That's interesting. You have such a deep background in government and nonprofit sector also. That's super interesting. It is a trend on the show. I see people who sometimes have family. I think you said your mom was a journalist. That's a trend too. People kind of, like you said, scratch the itch at some point sooner or later. So that's great.
Well, to me, I almost feel like a failure, right? Because I just always assumed I was going to be like the writer or the editor. And obviously, I have so much respect and admiration for my colleagues who are doing that work. And I feel like my job is to make sure they can continue it and sustain it and grow it. So I'm serving them.
That's great. That's a great skill set to have. And so that's a great segue. I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about Deep South today, just as an organization, where we kind of talked about your coverage area, like your audiences, business model, et cetera. I'd love it. Just hear an
Absolutely.
overview.
So, right now we have two newsrooms, Mississippi Today, which is obviously in Mississippi, and Verite News here in New Orleans, where I'm coming from. Mississippi Today is now almost 10 years old. It was founded as the first nonprofit newsroom in the state. It's now the largest newsroom in the state. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2023 and was a finalist for the Pulitzer again in 2024. So obviously doing really impactful work in that state. And then Verite News here in New Orleans is about 3 years old. They are growing pretty rapidly and doing some really important, impactful work here in the city. And Deep South Today really got started as a way to support both of those newsrooms with a centralized infrastructure to make things more efficient, to achieve some economies of scale. Because, we're doing this work in a really under-resourced region. It's very underserved by journalism. We need as much local reporting as we can get. And so I think, this idea of consolidating resources, building infrastructure that can support multiple newsrooms, doing more with less, being able to inspire, support, nationally and regionally, but of course locally to make sure that this work can continue and grow is really, really important. And so we really see our mission as meeting the need for local news wherever it exists in this region. And there's a lot of room to grow. And, the way that I sort of built Deep South Today was in anticipation of scale. And now that we're supporting two newsrooms with the same infrastructure, it actually makes it a lot easier to support more efforts. Obviously the per unit cost of reporting goes down the bigger we get. Also, our audiences increase as we grow, which creates new revenue opportunities, both in terms of earned revenue and philanthropy. And then we're finding all of these really interesting ways to build capacity across the network, just, through collaborative opportunities, with the newsrooms. And so what we're finding is we can help each individual newsroom grow and do more. We can do more in more places geographically, and then we can do more collectively as a network by scaling those capacities. And we can talk more about that, I'm sure, as you walk me through this interview.
Yeah. Actually, that was actually my next bullet point I have was just, so it's kind of a broad question, really. Like I mentioned, the Neiman Lab piece, which I'll link to in the show notes if anybody wants to go read it. It's a good piece. I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit about, I had written down the benefits of centralizing business functions while keeping journalism local, which is kind of self-explanatory. But what's that look like? What have you learned from operating like that, like boots on the ground? I'm curious that others could take away.
So I'm really, really bullish on this model. And like I said, it's particularly in our region, just because, the way I'll put it, to folks who don't really understand, the Deep South is, we're, again, operating in these two states right now, Mississippi and Louisiana. Each state has a population of roughly 3 million people. Each state has very similar demographics and challenges and politics. And if you were to throw like a state like Arkansas in the mix, which is contiguous with both Mississippi and Louisiana, that state also has a population of about 3 million. And again, similar demographics, politics, et cetera. If you were to take those three states together, you reach a population of 9 million. And so you're finally approaching sort of the population of a mid-sized to major metro in the United States. And I think that really helps sort of paint the picture of why this is important and why the scale is important. These are also very rural states. We don't have any really big cities in these states. So, like you think about Texas, which is, off to our western side, and they have multiple, big cities that each have populations that are, roughly the same size or bigger than our entire region.
Right. Yeah.
So we don't have population density. These are rural, sparsely populated places. So when I talk about what it means to be responsible with resources, it just makes sense for us to centralize as you would, probably with one newsroom in any of these sort of major metros around the United States. But, beyond that, we, obviously want to make sure that the newsrooms themselves are very low, their audiences and the people that they're serving. And so I'm not looking to create like a cookie cutter, like newspaper chain model where each, newsroom has the same exact name and is approaching everything in the same exact way, because the key is here, these states are very different. I mean, they're all in the South, but they have different personalities, different identities. And we want to make sure that the people we serve understand that, we don't see them as homogenous, that we understand the nuances and the particularities of these places. And so the newsrooms themselves on an editorial basis, are autonomous. Their editors-in-chief direct the news coverage. The reporters, and editors are on the ground in those places. They're simply being supported by the same, again, infrastructure when it comes to the boring stuff like finance and HR and technology, but also the fun stuff when it comes to audience engagement. And, when I talk about building capacities, we're talking about doing that in things like multimedia, video and audio, which are expensive to do. Investigative reporting, which also is the most expensive kind of reporting to do. If we can find, again, those economies of scale and share resources across the network, we can do more of that. The other thing I'll just say is, in our region, we've lost so much news. So many small local papers have gone out of business. The Associated Press no longer has a presence in Mississippi. They're just like these big news deserts. And so if we don't do this work, nobody else will. And so we have to find a way to do it, again, in the most efficient way possible. So I love this model where we have multiple newsrooms in different places doing their work independently with their own identity. But, we're just sharing, the resources that we can put together to make sure this work can be sustained.
That's great. Yeah, I'm in a pretty rural area. I'm in Western Colorado. So we have Denver. It's a mid-sized metro. But then my wife and I came out here a few years ago, and I think sometimes people forget just in the space, most people are in big cities. So a lot of people I talk to are in big cities, and you just kind of take it for granted, that population density. But, being on the ground in a town of 20,000 here, I understand how you do need so it gives me a clearer picture on how this model is super beneficial to areas like that. When you talked about kind of sharing resources between newsrooms, I'm also curious, I hadn't added this in the notes, but is there also collaboration in reporting? Like if there's a story that pops up, this for, one newsroom breaks it, but it's really relevant to the whole region, will it go up on the other digital platforms or wherever also?
Yeah, more and more that's happening. I think what's fun also about our organization is the culture that we're creating. So again, we want to make sure that the newsrooms themselves and the reporters understand they're doing their thing in their places, and we're not looking to sort of mandate any kind of particular line of reporting or anything like that. But as we come together as an organization, and by the way, our reporters and editors and employees have all unionized, and that was a very amicable process. We recognized the union, and so they're all together, as Deep South Today employees. We've had, multiple staff retreats where everybody comes together in one place and talks. And I guess my point in saying all this is some of these collaborations have happened organically. As the journalists have come to know each other, they have relationships. They say, hey, you might be interested in this story, or perhaps we could work together on that. And so, obviously we do, then when those things happen, make sure that those stories live, on both of our sites and across the network. But also, we just actually hired Ethan Brown as our senior editor for collaborations. And this was part of a combination that we just announced actually this week, Paul, where, the project that was known as the Garrison Project that Ethan Brown was running for the last few years, that's really centered around investigative reporting on criminal justice issues, is now moved into the Deep South Today family. And Ethan's going to continue doing criminal justice investigative reporting focused on our region, but very intentionally, he is going to be our collaborations editor so that he can help sort of work with these journalists in our various newsrooms and figure out how to do the exact thing you're talking about, Paul. How do we kind of cover the region at scale in these sort of collaborative ways? And so it's something we're definitely going to be doing more of, but I want to emphasize that it's not like a top-down mandate. It's a bottom-up opportunity for our journalists who seem to be really excited about it.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least that was the plan. Except now the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
That's great. You kind of piqued my interest. So if I'm a reader of Mississippi Today or Verite news. Are they like, is the average reader, is the branding there where they're aware it's part of a broader, like the Deep South Today network? Or
So, well, we kind of stay in the background. We don't want to get in between the relationship that the reader has with the newsroom. And so, yeah, we're not like blasting the Deep South Today brand in front of people, or we want them to connect with the local newsroom. But I think more and more, people are becoming aware, at least of sort of the general framework that we're building here. And some of that is also because we're doing more in the realm of events and programming. We think that's a really important way to connect with our audiences on the ground, to help convey the news in a different way, to bring, obviously, the news makers in front of our audiences. It's just good for conveying information, but also for building connection and community. And so, that's another capacity that Deep South Today is sort of making possible for the newsrooms. And so that Deep South Today brand does get in front of people. And for instance, we just had a major event in Jackson, Mississippi at the end of July. And I actually interviewed Jamie Dimon, who's the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And we had a kind of whole series of panel discussions on different issues. But that was very much sort of Deep South Today and Mississippi Today working together to bring an event of that caliber to the Jackson community.
yeah, I saw that, and I was actually going to bring that up. That's really cool. I was like, he had Jamie Dimon he interviewed. That's impressive. How was
Thank
that?
you.
How was that experience? So I
Well,
meant to listen to it before I hopped on, and then I got bogged down in a million other things. Apologies. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we were obviously thrilled to have the opportunity to have an event that was presented by JP Morgan Chase. And, I think they, are getting more and more interested in supporting efforts like ours, because I think they understand that having access to credible local news and information is critical, not just for sort of the civic health of a community, but actually for the economic and business health of a community. I mean, you can't really operate a business or build an economy if there's no sort of source of information that everybody can depend on. And so, we really appreciated the partnership with them. But also, the event itself was just an opportunity to talk about really important issues in the state of Mississippi, which included the issue of brain drain, where, a lot of talented people who grow up in Mississippi oftentimes will leave and not come back. And that obviously is really detrimental, I think, to the development of the state. And so, our panel was about, how do you retain talent? How do you bring it back? And that was really productive. We also had a panel about the economic revitalization of downtown Jackson that featured, the new mayor of Jackson who'd just been elected and the head of the downtown there. And so, being able to convene, leaders across the community and citizens, and to have these really important discussions, again, I think is a public service that we, as the biggest newsroom in the state, have had the opportunity to provide.
Excellent. That's really cool. So back to something you said before, you talked about, the benefits of economies of scale, and having a certain size audience opens up new opportunities and everything, which is one of the great parts about this kind of model. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what is the scale of Deep South Today, and what do you think, like, if you have any thoughts on like what a critical mass would be to get something like this started if somebody else is thinking about it. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I would say we've achieved that critical mass in the sense of, the two newsrooms that we already have. But I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of room to grow. And I want to emphasize that, we're very intentional in that we're motivated by need. This is not like a manifest destiny situation where we just feel like we have to like take over the South and be the only news source. In fact, quite the opposite. Like, I think the days of like this intense competition among news organizations is kind of over. That's like a very 20th century thing when like people actually cared like who broke the story. Now, I don't think that's sort of a value proposition. I don't think people want the information, but they're not paying attention to who broke it first, because at this point, it's a matter of seconds before things, kind of get out across the internet. And the truth is, like, there's more work that needs to be done than any of us can do by ourselves. So instead of worrying about competing, we should be worried about how we collaborate, how we sort of think about the division of labor. So when I'm looking at like what our scale should be, I'm looking at, again, where are the gaps? Where is the most need? Where can we be additive? Where can we uniquely provide a service that nobody else is providing? And then if we do that, also, how can we work with people who are already in that space so that we're not, again, disrupting or displacing the work that we're doing, we're really complementing it. And so we're finding that, is working really well in Mississippi and New Orleans now. But, as I'm looking, at, the rest of Louisiana, at the state of Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, places like that, we're thinking, okay, now that we have this centralized infrastructure, how can we use it to either create new newsroom opportunities or work with existing newsrooms so that together, we're actually like coloring in all those empty spaces and serving the people who aren't being served right now.
Excellent. That's where following the need is how it should be naturally. That also kind of helps tie into another question I have was, so you said that when you kind of came on board or the newsroom launched that you had scale in mind from the get-go, like kind of from the beginning. And then in the Neiman Lab piece, I think they quoted you saying that growing too fast is risky. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, how you think about it. Things break if you grow too fast. I'm rambling. I'd love to hear your thoughts kind of on that.
Yeah. No, it's the right question. I mean, it's always about, finding that sweet spot and that balance because, I do not want us to be afraid to take risks or to do, to try to grow in ways that, again, like help us meet our mission. But, at the same time, like you have to obviously be responsible in how you sort of measure that risk and think about it. Where I'm trying to be careful is, obviously as a nonprofit organization, you're dependent on various sources of revenue and you try to find like a good mix of that so you're not dependent on one too much than the other. And so that mix, typically is philanthropy, and that philanthropy is, institutional, but it's also individual. It's big grants, but it's also like small donors because you want to have a really, strong base of people in the community who are supporting you. And then you want to have earned revenue, through things like advertising and events and, other ways to kind of, inspire support, from different places. When you grow as a nonprofit organization, and especially when you're depending on stuff like philanthropy, which, is purely dependent on how somebody feels about you year over year over year, you have to understand that like you may have money to grow this year, but you have to be thinking about like, how are you going to sustain that growth? Because once you grow, then that just almost puts more pressure on you to, keep raising money at that level or finding, those resources. On top of that, there's, the capacity issue at the organizational level, because, we do have the centralized infrastructure and I'm trying to keep it as lean as possible because the whole model sort of is based on that efficiency, right? But as you grow, I mean, you do have to continue to invest in that infrastructure because, one person can't do one function, across multiple newsrooms forever, especially as you add more newsrooms. Like you'll have to kind of build up your teams in all of these different functions, whether they're HR or finance or technology or whatever. So understanding and anticipating, that when you grow over here, you're going to have to invest more over there and not stretch your team too thin and all of that. These are the things that I'm taking into consideration. And again, the sustaining piece of it is probably the most important, how you're kind of your growth so that that you can sustain it.
Excellent answer. What does you don't have to give me numbers. Can you give us a picture of what the revenue mix looks like between like philanthropy, earned revenue, events? I don't know what else you've got going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, we're still building, but I would say that, like a greater proportion of our revenue right now is definitely, coming from philanthropy. And what we're doing is considering also that, a piece of that philanthropy is an investment in building out our capacity to do more of the earned revenue pieces of this. So, I think what we're going to see is kind of like those proportions change very methodically and intentionally over the next couple of years to where it becomes more balanced. But right now, it's heavier on the philanthropic side than it is on the earned revenue side.
Excellent. And then I'm not sure if you touched on this before, but what's the format look like? You've obviously got a really nice digital presence. Do you have newsletters? You mentioned audio and video. Like you said, they're expensive and or take a lot of time, or both. But what's all that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are a fully digital news organization. So obviously that begins with, the reporting, being presented on our websites as news articles. But, we are constantly evolving to sort of meet our audience where, they are, but also how they want to consume information. So, we're obviously across now every social media channel, kind of delivering our content in that way. We've made investments in certainly videos. So we're, doing videos on YouTube and TikTok, and they kind of run the gamut in terms of, kind of vertical video with our journalists explaining stories to sort of, short and even now longer form sort of documentary type videos. We're even delivering content now via SMS texting as communities have sort of expressed a desire for that. And, we're just always open to other platforms and other ways of delivering the news. I think that's just going to continue to evolve and you can't stay static. But it's exciting, to be just on the cutting edge of all of this work right now.
Yeah, I think that's the way you have to be thinking about it. Attention is spread over so many platforms now. And I always get frustrated with like short form video. Like that's where people are, but it's just like, not a huge fan of some of those platforms, not wanting to let people off the platform or anything. That's kind of been a theme on this show is how do you grow social media and still get them back to, know where their news is coming from and everything. But it's necessary at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you point out something I think that's really important, which is, people are consuming a lot of information, but I think sometimes they don't even know where to originate it from, right? Because it's been shared in so many places or it's been aggregated by somebody. So somebody will say, I definitely read about this, I know about this, but they're maybe don't know that it was originally reported by Verite News or Mississippi Today. And so we have to think about what that means for our business and how we track our audience and our impact. Now, I should mention, we don't have a paywall. So like all of our information is free to consume. And then, we also actually have, a Creative Commons license, and we intentionally want, local papers in our geographies to carry our stories because we want them to have the content if they think it's useful to them. So it's not like we're trying to make money off clicks, so to speak. But in the long run, we do want to have a sense of who's reading our stuff and what kind of impact we're having. And so we're trying to think about, how do you measure that across all of these different places? Is there a way to kind of track where the information is ending up and how people are consuming it? And if we can be that primary source, obviously we want to be that. But just even knowing that in a better way, I think is a challenge for us and across journalism right now.
Yep. Yeah. You're not alone. Definitely not. You talked about how back in the heyday in the 20th century, when it's all about breaking a story, it's hard to find that out even if you're paying attention these days. Like I have a curated newsletter I put out just on the local media industry. So I'm just curating stories and I'll see a story pop up a few times. And it's honestly hard for me to dig up because that's what I want to link to, who broke the story. It's like hard to even, if you're trying to do that. So the average reader, it's more, that's why I think it's a good idea to lean into the collaboration and working, not such fierce competition, kind of like you mentioned before.
Yeah. And actually, when you talk about collaboration in that respect too, I think, across formats, as your question just went, I mean, we love working with public media. I think, there's going to be a lot more opportunity to do that because obviously they're expert in, audio and video and all of that. And if we can kind of put all of our resources together and again, kind of divide the labor, share the content, then I think, it's a win-win across the board, including for obviously the people we're trying to serve in the first place.
Perfect. So we've gone through all the questions I wrote out, but something else came up a few times when you were talking. You spoke about the culture you're building and some of the people you're working with there, like the boots on the ground reporters and journalists and everything. It's a really good idea to be thinking about culture from the get-go. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, how you're finding talent, how you're keeping them there. You said you're amicably recognize their union and everything. That's great. But just some thoughts on that side, on the actual team.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I think, journalists want to be part of an organization that, has the highest standards of quality and integrity. And because, both of our newsrooms are being recognized with, national, regional, local awards, and people understand that this is an important place to be doing this work and that the work is going to be, respected and held in high esteem. I think that certainly helps us attract talent. We're really intentional also about really trying to be a place where we can incubate talent. So, we have fellowships and internships and We don't just want to import talent from outside the region, but we want to be a place where we can sort of help create a pipeline of new young journalists. And so I think that piece of the culture is important. I think people understand that, like, even though, places like Mississippi and Louisiana are not maybe as glamorous as New York City or LA or something like that, it's a place, again, where the issues are important and need, deep reporting. And so people who are really just interested in the work of journalism want to be in this place because of, again, the impact that their journalism is going to have. I think they like to know that they're valued as employees. And I think, the unionization effort was part of that. To be honest with you, I feel like from the get-go, we were paying good salaries, we were offering good benefits, we were offering a place where I think, there's just a very healthy relationship and sense of security and stability. And I think all of that is really important in the journalism industry right now in particular, because of the challenges that so many people are facing in other places. And then again, we are ambitious and we're always looking for new ways to support the work that's happening. And so, again, to repeat some of the stuff I mentioned, just, how Deep South Today is looking for ways to, create more capacity in multimedia, video, audio, investigative reporting. We have a lot of really interesting things happening. And so I think everyone understands that this is a place where we're trying to solve problems, where we can get things done, where the answer is not no, it's like, we'd love to figure it out, whenever anybody has a new idea. And I think all of those things are helping us attract and retain talent here, again, in a challenging part of the country.
That's great to hear. Yeah, that's, once again, great mindset there. And, you said that maybe that area isn't the most glamorous part of the country, but I don't know. If I was a young journalist, in addition to that culture, you could probably lure me in with just some beignets and some crawfish etouffee also. That's a big pull also.
Yeah, well, New Orleans, I'll say, is a fantastic place to live and work and be. And yeah, it's a special place. If people don't know it, they should definitely get to know it.
Yeah, I've just been once and I loved it. I've been meaning to get back. I will at some point. Great. Well, Warwick, we got through everything. This was awesome. I think we got a lot of value out of this. I would love to just let people know where they can find you and your newsrooms and any other things you want to point people to in the show notes or announcements you have or anything like that. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, our website for Deep South Today is deepsouthtoday.org. And obviously we provide a lot of information there, but you can go directly to Mississippi Today at mississipitoday.org or Verite News at veritenews.org. We're across, all of the social media channels, with our newsrooms. So kind of easy to find there. And, we're easy to contact, easy to get a hold of, and always want to be responsive to anybody who's got questions.
Wonderful. I will link to all that in the show notes. So if you're listening, you can just scroll right down in your app and click on it and you can check all that stuff out on your own. I'll also link to the piece in Neiman Lab that I mentioned earlier. If anybody wants to have a read on that, because I think that's a really good piece too, that kind of highlights this kind of model also. But Warwick, thank you so much. Once again, I appreciate you taking the time. And I hope you have a great day.
You too. This was a pleasure, Paul. Thanks again for inviting me.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.